They say power corrupts. But what happens when power meets someone who's already been through hell and came out forged in iron? I'm about to tell you a story that changed everything. Not just for me, but for a man who thought his badge made him untouchable. Subscribe to this channel if you've ever faced someone who abused their authority and had to decide whether to break or stand your ground. Because what happened that night in Moscow wasn't just about an arrest. It was about justice, consequence, and the moment a predator realized he'd cornered the wrong prey. My name is Anatoly. And this is the story of how a corrupt federal agent tried to destroy my life, and how the universe had other plans. The rain was falling hard that October night, turning the streets of Moscow into rivers of black asphalt that reflected the neon signs like broken promises. I was walking home from the gym, my sanctuary, my church, the only place where the weight of my past didn't feel so heavy. The iron never judges. It never lies. You lift it or you don't. Simple. Honest. Pure. I had my gym bag over my shoulder, my old military jacket keeping the cold at bay, and my mind was somewhere between the present and the ghosts that always seemed to walk beside me. The streets were mostly empty at this hour. 2:47 a.m. according to the clock on the bank building. Just a few stragglers making their way home and the occasional car splashing through puddles. I didn't see them coming until it was too late. 3 black SUVs came screaming around the corner, tires squealing against wet pavement. And suddenly I was surrounded by flashing red and blue lights that painted the buildings around me in colors of authority and threat. Doors flew open. Men in tactical gear poured out, weapons drawn, shouting commands that echoed off the concrete walls. On the ground. Now. Hands where we can see them. My body went into autopilot, the kind of response you develop when you've spent years in places where hesitation means death. I assessed the situation in seconds. 7 men. All armed. All trained. Fighting wasn't an option here. Not yet. So I did what they asked. I dropped to my knees, placed my hands behind my head, and let the cold rain soak through my clothes while they surrounded me like wolves circling wounded prey. But I wasn't wounded. Not yet. That's when I saw him step out of the lead vehicle. Special Agent Viktor Krupin. I knew the name, knew the reputation. Everyone in Moscow's underworld, and even those of us who'd left that world behind, knew about Krupin. He was FSB, Federal Security Service, and he was corrupt to his core. A man who used his badge not to serve justice but to line his pockets and settle personal scores. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with a kind of face that looked like it had been carved from granite and cruelty. His eyes were cold, calculating, the eyes of a man who'd learned long ago that empathy was a weakness he couldn't afford. He wore an expensive suit under his tactical vest, a detail that told you everything you needed to know about where his priorities lay. He approached me slowly, deliberately, his boots splashing through puddles with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. When he stood over me, he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a predator who'd just found his next meal. Anatoly Petrov, he said, his voice smooth as oil and twice as slick. We finally meet. I looked up at him, rain running down my face, and said nothing. In my experience, men like Krupin love to hear themselves talk. Better to stay silent and learn what you're dealing with before you make your move. You know, he continued, circling me like a shark, you've been on my radar for a while now. Former military. Served in some very interesting places. Did some very interesting things. And now you're what? A gym rat? A nobody lifting weights and pretending the past doesn't exist. He crouched down so his face was level with mine. But the past always catches up, doesn't it? And tonight, your past just arrived in 3 black SUVs. What do you want? I asked, my voice steady despite the rage beginning to build in my chest. Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone who had the power to destroy your life and felt absolutely no fear, only cold, calculating fury? In a moment, you'll understand why that absence of fear was exactly what made Krupin nervous. He stood up, brushing rain off his expensive suit. What do I want? I want what's owed to me. You see, I've been investigating a certain, let's call it a financial discrepancy. Money that disappeared from a military fund during your time in service. Money that never quite made it where it was supposed to go. And I have evidence, very compelling evidence, that suggests you might know something about that. My blood ran cold. Not because I was guilty, I wasn't, but because I understood immediately what was happening. This wasn't about justice. This wasn't even about money. This was about leverage. Krupin had identified me as someone with a past complicated enough to make accusations stick, someone isolated enough to make an easy target, and someone who, if framed properly, could be used to serve whatever agenda he was really pursuing. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. He laughed. It was a sound without humor, without warmth. "Of course you don't. That's what they all say. But here's the thing, Anatoly. I don't really care whether you did it or not. What I care about is that I can prove you did. Or at least, I can create enough doubt, enough questions, enough mess in your life that you'll wish you'd never crossed my path. I haven't crossed your path. Not yet. But you're about to make a choice that will determine whether you simply disappear into the system for a few years, or whether this ends much, much worse for you." One of his men handed him a folder. He opened it, pulled out several documents, and held them where I could see them even as rain began to blur the ink. Bank transfers, witness statements, photographs, all very official, all very damning, all very flexible, depending on how cooperative you decide to be. That's when I understood. This wasn't about old crimes or military investigations. This was about extortion. Krupin wanted something from me, information, money, cooperation in some scheme, and he was using his position to manufacture a case against me to force my compliance. "What do you want?" I asked again, this time with the weariness of a man who'd played this game before in different countries under different circumstances. "Smart question," he said, snapping the folder shut. "I want you to do a job for me. There's a businessman, Dmitry Volkov, who's been causing problems for some associates of mine. He has a safe in his home office. Inside that safe are documents I need. You're going to get them for me. I'm not a thief. You are whatever I say you are. You're a thief if I need a thief. You're a murderer if I need a murderer. You're innocent if you do what I ask, and you're guilty if you don't. That's how power works, Anatoly. And I have all of it right now." The rain continued to fall. My knees ached from kneeling on concrete. The guns pointed at me never wavered. And in that moment, I had to make a choice that would define everything that followed. I could comply. I could become Krupin's puppet, do his dirty work, and maybe, come out the other side with my freedom intact. Or I could resist, face whatever fabricated charges he threw at me, and trust that somehow, somewhere, the truth would matter. But I'd learned long ago that the truth didn't always matter. Power mattered. Evidence mattered. And right now, Krupin had both. "I need time to think," I said. He smiled again, that predator's smile. "You have until tomorrow night, 8 p.m. I'll send you the address. If you're not there with those documents, I'll have you arrested by 9. And trust me, once you're in the system, once my evidence is official record, you'll never climb out of that hole." He gestured to his men, and they hauled me to my feet with rough hands that left bruises on my arms. "Take him home," Krupin ordered. "Make sure he understands we're watching." They threw me into one of the SUVs. The ride to my apartment took 15 minutes, and not one of the tactical officers spoke to me. They didn't need to. The message was clear. I was trapped, and Krupin held all the cards. When they dumped me at my building's entrance, soaked to the bone and shaking, not from cold but from rage, I watched the SUVs disappear into the Moscow night. And I stood there in the rain, staring at my hands, and felt something break open inside me. Have you ever been pushed so far that you stopped caring about the consequences and started caring only about what was right? Soon you'll see what happens when a man who's already lost everything decides he has nothing left to lose. I climbed the stairs to my third-floor apartment, each step feeling heavier than the last. My clothes left a trail of water behind me. My mind raced through options, scenarios, calculations. Krupin expected me to fold. Men like him always did. They believed that fear and power were enough to control anyone. But they'd never met someone like me. Inside my apartment, I stripped off my wet clothes and stood under a hot shower until the water ran cold. The heat did nothing to wash away the anger, the sense of injustice, the burning knowledge that somewhere in the city, a corrupt federal agent was celebrating what he thought was an easy victory. I dressed in dry clothes, made strong black coffee, and sat at my small kitchen table with a notebook and pen. Old habits from military intelligence work. Sometimes the best plans are written by hand, where no digital trail can follow. First, I wrote down everything I knew about Viktor Krupin, his reputation for corruption, his known associates, the types of schemes he typically ran, the businesses he protected, the people he'd destroyed. I'd heard stories over the years, whispers in gyms, conversations in the darker corners of Moscow's social landscape, about agents like him who used their badges as weapons for personal gain. Second, I listed my resources. They were limited. I had some money saved, not much, but enough for basics. I had skills from my military past that most civilians didn't possess. I had contacts, though I deliberately distanced myself from that world years ago. And I had something else. I had nothing left to lose. When you've already survived the worst life can throw at you, when you've already walked through your personal hell and come out the other side, threats lose their power. Third, I planned. Not how to steal documents from Dmitry Volkov. I had no intention of becoming Krupin's criminal, but how to turn the situation around. How to expose what Krupin was doing. How to gather evidence of his corruption. How to make him pay for trying to destroy an innocent man's life. It was a dangerous plan. Suicidal, even. Going after a federal agent, especially one as connected and ruthless as Krupin, was asking for destruction. But the alternative, becoming his puppet, living in fear, surrendering my dignity, that was a different kind of death. And I'd already died once in my life. I had no intention of doing it again. By the time dawn broke over Moscow, painting the sky in shades of gray and gold, I had a plan. It wasn't perfect. It would require timing, courage, and a willingness to walk into the fire. But it was mine. And after years of letting life happen to me, after years of running from my past and hiding in the sanctuary of iron and routine, it felt good to finally take action. I slept for 3 hours. When I woke, I made more coffee and began making calls. The first was to Sergey, an old friend from my military days who'd transitioned into private security. If anyone knew how to move through Moscow's criminal and political underworld without leaving tracks, it was him. Anatoly. His voice was surprised when he answered. We hadn't spoken in 2 years. This is unexpected. I need information, I said, about a federal agent named Viktor Krupin. There was a long pause. That's a dangerous name to be asking about. I know, but I don't have a choice. Another pause. Then, meet me at the old place. Noon. Come alone. The old place was a small cafe near Gorky Park, the kind of establishment that had survived decades through discretion and the understanding that certain conversations happened there without record or memory. I arrived 15 minutes early, scanned for surveillance, and took a corner table with clear sightlines to both entrances. Sergey arrived exactly at noon. He was heavier than I remembered, his hair thinner, but his eyes still held that sharp intelligence that had made him one of the best analysts in our unit. He sat across from me without greeting, ordered black tea, and waited until the server left before speaking. Krupin approached you, he said. It wasn't a question. Last night. Wants me to steal documents from someone. Has fabricated evidence to force my cooperation. Sergey nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. You're not the first. There are at least 4 others I know about in the past 2 years. All former military. All with complicated pasts that make them vulnerable to accusations. All forced into situations where they either comply or face destruction. What happened to them? His face darkened. 2 complied. They're still working for him, trapped in a cycle of increasingly dangerous jobs. 1 refused and is currently in prison, serving 8 years for crimes everyone knows he didn't commit. The 4th. He paused. The 4th tried to fight back. They found his body in the Moscow River 3 months ago. The weight of that information settled over the table like a fog. I'd known the stakes were high, but hearing the specifics, knowing that men like me had already fallen into Krupin's trap, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because someone needs to stop him. And because I've been watching you for years, Anatoly. I know you left the service broken. I know you've spent the last 5 years rebuilding yourself 1 repetition at a time in that gym. But I also know who you were before you broke. And if anyone has a chance of taking down Krupin, it's you. Have you ever had someone see the version of yourself you thought you'd buried forever? In the next few minutes, you'll learn why sometimes the only way forward is to become who you used to be, even if it terrifies you. I'm not that person anymore, I said quietly. Maybe not. But he's still in there. And right now, he's the only person who can survive what you're about to face. Sergey reached into his jacket and pulled out a small USB drive. He slid it across the table. Everything I've gathered on Krupin over the past year. Financial records showing suspicious transactions. Testimonies from people he's extorted. Connections to organized crime. Evidence of evidence tampering. It's not enough to bring him down on its own, he's too well protected, but it's a start. I took the drive, feeling its weight in my palm. What do you want in return? When this is over, if you survive, I want you to give that information to someone who can use it. Someone in the prosecutor's office who's actually clean. They're rare, but they exist. And I want Krupin to pay for what he's done. That's it. He stood, dropped money on the table for his untouched tea. That's it. Except one more thing. Whatever you're planning, do it fast. Krupin doesn't like to wait, and the longer you take, the more desperate and dangerous he becomes. You have until tomorrow night, he said. I nodded. Then you have less than 30 hours to either become his puppet or destroy him. Choose wisely. He left without another word, disappearing into the Moscow afternoon like a ghost. I sat there for another 10 minutes, the USB drive burning in my pocket, before I finally rose and made my way back to my apartment. The rest of that day I spent analyzing Sergey's information. It was extensive, detailed, and damning. Krupin had been running his extortion and corruption scheme for at least 3 years, using his position to force former military and intelligence personnel into criminal acts, then using those acts to further control them. He'd stolen millions in rubles through various schemes. He'd destroyed lives with the casual indifference of a man swatting flies. And he'd done it all with complete impunity because everyone was too afraid to stand against a federal agent with his level of power and connections. But as I read through the documents, as I saw the pattern of his crimes, I began to see something else. Weaknesses. Krupin was arrogant. He'd grown comfortable in his corruption, sloppy with his digital trail. He believed himself untouchable, and that belief had made him careless. Every predator has a weakness. Every system has a breaking point. I just needed to find his. By midnight, I had a plan. It was risky. It required me to walk directly into Krupin's trap while simultaneously setting one of my own. But it was the only way I could see to end this without either becoming his puppet or ending up dead in the Moscow River. I spent the next morning preparing. I went to the gym and trained harder than I had in months, pushing my body until my muscles screamed, until sweat poured off me in rivers, until the iron became not just physical exercise but a meditation, a focusing of will and purpose. Each rep was a prayer. Each set was a promise to myself that I would not break, would not bend, would not surrender to corruption and power. The other gym members watched me with concern. They'd never seen me train with such intensity, such controlled fury. When I finally finished, my usual training partner, Ivan, approached me carefully. "Brother," he said, "whatever you're facing, you don't have to face it alone." I looked at him, this man who'd become a friend through shared suffering and iron, and felt a surge of gratitude. But this wasn't his fight. I wouldn't drag anyone else into my war with Krupin. "Thank you," I said. "But this is something I have to do myself." He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. "Then go with strength. And come back." I showered, dressed, and returned to my apartment for the final preparations. At 6 p.m., my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It contained an address and 3 words, 8 p.m. Don't disappoint. I had 2 hours. I spent the first hour reviewing my plan one final time, checking every detail, considering every possible outcome. I packed a small backpack with specific items I'd need. I transferred Sergey's USB drive to a secure location where it would be found if anything happened to me. And I wrote a letter, just in case, explaining everything, naming names, providing evidence. I sealed it and left instructions for its delivery with my landlord if I didn't return by morning. Then I dressed in dark clothes, laced up my boots, and stepped out into the Moscow night. The address Krupin had sent led me to an industrial district on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where abandoned factories crumbled beside active warehouses, where the streetlights were sparse, and where people minded their own business because asking questions could get you hurt. The building itself was a 3-story warehouse that had clearly seen better days. Broken windows on the upper floors. Graffiti covering the walls. The smell of rust and decay hanging in the air. A single entrance with a dim light above it, casting shadows that moved like living things. I approached carefully, every sense heightened, every muscle ready. This was the moment. This was where everything would be decided. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped into darkness. Punctual, Krupin's voice echoed from somewhere in the shadows. I appreciate that in a man. Lights flickered on, revealing the interior of the warehouse. Empty space stretched before me, concrete floor stained with oil and time. And standing at the center, surrounded by 4 of his tactical officers, was Viktor Krupin, still wearing that expensive suit, still wearing that predator smile. Welcome, Anatoly. I trust you brought what I asked for. I walked forward slowly, my hands visible, my posture non-threatening. I need to know something first. You're not in a position to negotiate. This isn't a negotiation. It's a question. Why me? With all the former military personnel in Moscow, why choose me specifically? He considered this for a moment, then shrugged as if the answer was obvious. Because you were convenient. Because your past made you vulnerable. Because I could. He spread his hands. There's no grand conspiracy, Anatoly. You're just unlucky. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong person noticing you. That's life. Have you ever realized that your life was about to change forever and felt absolutely calm, like you've been preparing for this moment your entire existence? What happens next will show you why sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. You're right, I said. That is life. But here's the thing about life, Krupin. It has a way of balancing the scales. You've been predator for so long, you forgot that sometimes the prey has teeth. His smile faded. What are you talking about? I reached into my jacket slowly. His men tensed, hands moving toward weapons. But I pulled out not a gun but a small digital recorder. I held it up where he could see it. For the past 36 hours, I've been gathering evidence against you. Financial records. Testimonies from your victims. Proof of your extortion schemes. And 20 minutes ago, I sent all of it to 3 different journalists, 2 prosecutors, and 1 very interested detective in the anti-corruption division. The color drained from his face. You're bluffing. Am I? Check your accounts. Check your protected servers. You'll find they've been accessed. You'll find records have been copied. You'll find that your carefully constructed empire of corruption is currently collapsing while you stand here threatening an innocent man. He moved then, faster than I expected for a man his size, crossing the distance between us with his hand reaching for the weapon at his hip. But I was faster. Years of military training, years of discipline, years of preparation for moments exactly like this, they all activated in an instant. I closed the distance, caught his wrist before the gun cleared leather, twisted with precise force that sent pain shooting through his arm. The weapon clattered to the concrete. His men rushed forward, but I positioned myself so Krupin was between us, a human shield bought with his own aggression. Tell them to stop, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. Or I break your arm. Stand down, Krupin shouted, his voice strained with pain. The tactical officers froze, uncertain. They'd trained for many scenarios, but probably not for their boss being disabled by an unarmed man in 3 seconds. Here's what's going to happen, I continued, still holding Krupin's arm at an angle that kept him compliant. You're going to call off your fabricated investigation. You're going to leave me alone. You're going to pray that the evidence I sent doesn't destroy you completely. And if you're very, very lucky, you might escape this with just your career ended instead of spending the next 20 years in the same prisons where you sent innocent men. You have no idea what you've done, he hissed. I have powerful friends. They'll hunt you. They'll destroy you. This doesn't end here. You're right. It doesn't end here. But it ends with you. Because I'm not the only person you've hurt, Krupin. I'm just the first one willing to fight back. And now that I've shown it's possible, how long do you think before your other victims find their courage? Before your enemies see your weakness? Before your powerful friends decide you're more liability than asset? I released him with a shove that sent him stumbling. He caught himself, turned to face me with murder in his eyes. For a moment, I thought he'd order his men to shoot me anyway, consequences be damned. But then something shifted in his expression. The realization that he'd lost, that his empire was crumbling, that the prey had indeed become the predator. "This isn't over," he said, but there was no conviction in it. "Yes," I replied. "It is." I walked past him, past his frozen tactical officers, toward the door. Every step felt like a mile. Every second, I expected to hear gunfire, to feel bullets tear through my back. But they never came. I reached the door, pushed it open, and stepped out into the Moscow night. The cold air hit my face like liberation. I didn't run. I walked with measured steps, controlling my breathing, forcing my heart rate down, maintaining awareness of my surroundings in case this was all a trap to make me vulnerable outside. But the night remained quiet. No pursuit. No ambush. Just the distant sounds of the city and my own footsteps on broken pavement. I made it 3 blocks before my legs finally gave out. I leaned against a wall, slid down to a crouch, and let the shaking take me. Not from fear. The fear had been burned away by action. But from the release of tension, the aftermath of adrenaline, the reality of what had just happened crashing over me like a wave. I'd done it. I'd faced down a corrupt federal agent and walked away. But more than that, I'd reclaimed something I'd lost years ago. The belief that one person could stand against injustice and win. The belief that power wasn't absolute. The belief that courage mattered. After several minutes, I stood, straightened my jacket, and began the long walk home. Dawn was still hours away, but I could already feel something breaking on the horizon. Not just the sun, but a new chapter of my life. I'd been hiding in the gym, hiding in routine, hiding from the past and from myself. But hiding was over. I spent the next 3 days waiting for the other shoe to drop. Waiting for Krupin's revenge. Waiting for federal agents to arrest me on trumped-up charges. Waiting for a bullet I'd never see coming. But none of it happened. Instead, the news began to circulate. First as rumors, then as headlines. Senior FSB agent under investigation for corruption. Federal agent linked to extortion scheme. Multiple victims come forward against corrupt official. The evidence I'd sent had found its way to people who cared about justice. The journalists had published. The prosecutors had opened investigations. And once the dam broke, once the first crack appeared in Krupin's armor of invincibility, everyone he'd ever wronged came forward with their stories. Within a week, Viktor Krupin was arrested. Not quietly, not with dignity, but with cameras recording his tactical officers, perhaps the same ones who'd been with him that night in the warehouse, led him out of his office in handcuffs. Within a month, 3 of his associates followed him into custody. The corruption scandal spread like fire through the department, burning away the rot, exposing the network of dirty agents who'd used their badges for personal gain. And I watched it all unfold from my small apartment, from my corner of the gym, from my quiet life that was no longer quite so quiet. People reached out, journalists wanting my story, prosecutors needing my testimony, even some of Krupin's other victims thanking me for having the courage they'd lacked. I gave what was necessary for the legal proceedings but kept the rest to myself. This wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about justice. About standing up when standing up seemed impossible. Have you ever wondered if one person's courage can change everything? In the final moments of this story, you'll discover that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to break. 3 months after that night in the warehouse, I received a letter. It was from Dmitry Volkov, the businessman Krupin had wanted me to rob. The letter was brief. Mr. Petrov, I've learned what you were asked to do and what you chose instead. In a world where so many take the easy path, you chose the hard one. You chose honor. Thank you for that. If you ever need anything, you have a friend. DV. Enclosed was a check for an amount that made my eyes widen. I almost sent it back. But then I realized this wasn't charity. It was acknowledgement. Recognition that choosing the right path often comes with a cost, and that cost shouldn't always fall on the person who made the choice. I used part of the money to help the families of the men who'd been destroyed by Krupin's schemes. I used another part to upgrade equipment at my gym, not for myself, but so others would have access to the same sanctuary of iron that had saved me. And I kept the rest as a cushion, a safety net against whatever challenges the future might bring. Because I'd learned something important through this entire ordeal. The past doesn't define you. Your choices do. I couldn't change what I'd been, the things I'd done, the man I'd been before I broke. But I could choose who I was now. And I chose to be someone who stood against injustice, even when it was terrifying, even when it seemed impossible, even when every logical voice said to surrender. 6 months after Krupin's arrest, I was training at the gym when a young man approached me. He was maybe 22, nervous, with a kind of desperate energy that comes from carrying a weight too heavy for your shoulders. "Are you Anatoly?" he asked. I set down the barbell, wiped sweat from my face. "I am. I heard what you did. Standing up to that agent. I'm in trouble. Someone's trying to force me into something bad, and I don't know what to do. I thought maybe you could help." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw myself from 6 months ago. Scared. Trapped. Searching for a way out that didn't exist until someone created it. "Tell me everything," I said. And as he spoke, as his story spilled out, I realized that what had happened with Krupin wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Because injustice doesn't sleep. Corruption doesn't stop. There will always be predators who use their power to destroy the innocent. But there will also always be people willing to stand against them. That night, after helping the young man develop a plan, after sharing what I'd learned, after giving him the courage to believe he could fight back, I walked home through Moscow streets that seemed somehow different than they had before. The city hadn't changed. I had. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, made my usual black coffee, and sat at my small kitchen table. I pulled out my notebook, the same one I'd used to plan my confrontation with Krupin, and opened to a fresh page. And I began to write. Not a plan this time. Not a strategy. But a list. A list of principles I'd learned through fire and fear and choosing courage when courage was the hardest thing in the world. 1. Power without accountability becomes corruption. Always. 2. The system won't save you. If you want justice, sometimes you have to fight for it yourself. 3. Fear is a tool of control. Once you accept the consequences and stop being afraid, the power dynamic shifts. 4. Evidence and truth matter, but only if someone is brave enough to bring them to light. 5. One person standing up gives others permission to do the same. 6. The strongest muscle you can build isn't in your body. It's the courage to do what's right when everything inside you screams to do what's safe. 7. Your past doesn't define you unless you let it. Every day is a choice to become someone new or remain someone old. I read through the list several times, then carefully tore the page from the notebook. I folded it and placed it in my wallet, where it would stay. A reminder, a compass, a piece of paper containing more strength than any weight I could lift. The legal proceedings against Krupin took another year to fully resolve. I testified 3 times, each appearance bringing back the memories of that night, the fear, the rage, the moment I decided to stand rather than break. But each testimony also reinforced something important. My voice mattered. My story mattered. And the truth, when spoken clearly and backed by evidence, had power. Krupin was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. His associates received similar sentences. The corruption network he'd built was dismantled. And while I knew that other corrupt agents probably existed, at least this one had been stopped. This one would hurt no more innocent people. The young man I'd helped, his name was Alexei, successfully fought back against his own extortion situation. He used the principles I'd shared, gathered evidence, and exposed the man trying to control him. When it was over, he came to the gym, found me, and simply said, "Thank you." We trained together after that. Not often, but regularly. And slowly, others joined us. Other men and women who'd faced their own Viktor Krupins, their own moments of impossible choice, their own battles between surrender and resistance. The gym became more than a place to lift weights. It became a community of people who'd chosen courage, who understood that strength wasn't just physical but moral, ethical, spiritual. 1 year to the day after my confrontation with Krupin, I was approached by a documentary filmmaker. She wanted to tell my story, to shine light on corruption in federal agencies, to inspire others who faced similar situations. I almost said no. My life wasn't material for entertainment. My struggles weren't content to be packaged and consumed. But then I thought about all the people who might be facing their own Viktor Krupins right now, in this moment, somewhere in Moscow or Russia or the world. People who felt alone, trapped, hopeless. People who believed that power was absolute and resistance was futile. If my story could give even one of those people the courage to stand up, to fight back, to refuse to break, Then wasn't that worth the discomfort of exposure? Okay, I told her. But we do it honestly. No heroic narratives. No simplification. Just the truth, including the fear, the doubt, the moments I almost broke. The documentary took 6 months to produce. During that time, I relived every moment of my confrontation with Krupin dozens of times through interviews, reconstructions, and reflections. It was exhausting. It was cathartic. It was necessary. When it premiered, I sat in a small theater in Moscow surrounded by strangers and watched my story unfold on screen. I watched the actor portraying me face down the actor portraying Krupin. I watched the moment of decision, the choice between surrender and resistance, played out in cinematic detail. And in the darkness of that theater, I heard people crying. Heard them whispering to each other. Heard them, as the credits rolled, sit in stunned silence before erupting into applause. After the screening, people approached me. Some wanted autographs, which felt absurd. I wasn't a celebrity, just a man who'd made a choice. But others wanted something different. They wanted to share their own stories of corruption, of abuse of power, of moments when they had to decide whether to break or stand. One woman, maybe 50 years old with tears streaming down her face, gripped my hand and said, "My brother was one of Krupin's victims. The one who refused and went to prison. He's serving 8 years for crimes he didn't commit. Watching your story, knowing someone finally stood up to that monster, it means everything." I didn't know what to say. What words could possibly address the pain of watching an innocent man imprisoned? But I squeezed her hand and said the only truth I knew. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't stop Krupin before he hurt your brother. But I promise you, I'll do everything I can to help get him freed. This isn't over." And it wasn't. With the documentary bringing renewed attention to Krupin's case, lawyers began reviewing the convictions of all his victims. Evidence of tampering was found. Testimonies were revealed to have been coerced. And slowly, painstakingly, the legal system began to correct its mistakes. 2 years after my confrontation with Krupin, the woman's brother was released from prison, his conviction overturned. I was there when he walked out, blinking in sunlight he hadn't seen without bars for so long. His sister ran to him, and their embrace was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever witnessed. He found me afterward, this man I'd never met but whose fate had been intertwined with mine through Krupin's corruption. "Thank you," he said simply. "I just did what anyone should do," I replied. He shook his head. "No. You did what most people are too afraid to do. You stood when standing seemed impossible. And because you stood, I'm free. Never underestimate what that means." We clasped hands, 2 men connected by trauma and triumph, by the shadow of a corrupt agent and the light of justice finally served. And in that moment, I understood something profound. My choice to resist hadn't just saved me. It had created ripples that touched lives I'd never known about, in ways I'd never anticipated. The gym continued to grow. What had started as my personal sanctuary became a community center, a place where people came not just to build physical strength but to find the courage to face their demons, fight their battles, stand against whatever injustice they faced in their lives. I started teaching classes, not just on fitness, but on what I'd learned. How to gather evidence safely. How to protect yourself when facing powerful opponents. How to find allies and build networks of support. How to transform fear into action. Some people called me paranoid. They said I was seeing conspiracies everywhere, turning people into vigilantes, creating problems where none existed. But then someone would approach me privately, share their story of abuse or corruption or injustice, and ask for help. And I'd know that what I was doing mattered. 3 years after my confrontation with Krupin, I received word that he died in prison. Heart attack, they said. Natural causes. I don't know if I believe that. Men like Krupin made many enemies, and prison is a dangerous place for corrupt federal agents. I didn't celebrate his death. I'd never wanted him dead. I'd wanted him stopped. I'd wanted justice. I'd wanted him to face consequences for his actions. His death felt like an escape, a way to avoid fully accounting for the lives he'd destroyed. But it also meant closure. He would hurt no one else. His empire of corruption was truly ended. And maybe, in whatever afterlife exists, he'd finally have to face the weight of what he'd done. On the anniversary of his death, I visited the memorial wall in Moscow where names of the fallen are remembered. I didn't add his name. But I stood there thinking about all the people who'd suffered because of him, all the lives altered by his choices, all the pain his corruption had caused. And I made a promise, to those victims, to myself, to whatever force in the universe cares about justice, that I would continue the work. That I would stand against corruption wherever I found it. That I would help others find the courage to resist. Because that's what strength really is. Not the ability to lift heavy weights or win fights or dominate others through force. Real strength is the courage to stand for what's right when standing is the hardest thing in the world. 5 years after my confrontation with Krupin, I woke up in my small apartment, made my usual black coffee, and prepared for another day. The gym. Training. Helping people. Living a life defined not by my past but by my choices. The sun rose over Moscow, painting the sky in colors of gold and fire. And I stood at my window, coffee in hand, looking out at a city full of people facing their own battles, their own moments of impossible choice. I couldn't help them all. I couldn't stop every corrupt official, fight every injustice, save every victim. But I could do something. I could stand. I could resist. I could show by example that power isn't absolute, that fear isn't permanent, that one person's courage can change everything. The iron weights waited at the gym. The people who needed help would find me. The next battle would come, because battles always do. But I was ready. I'd been ready since that night in the rain when Viktor Krupin thought he'd trapped a helpless victim and instead found a man who refused to break. I finished my coffee, dressed, and stepped out into the Moscow morning. The air was cold but clean. The city was waking up. And somewhere in its millions of people, someone was facing their own Viktor Krupin, their own moment of choice between surrender and resistance. I hope they chose resistance. I hope they chose courage. I hope they remembered that they weren't alone, that others had stood before them and survived, that the power oppressors claim is never as absolute as they pretend. And if they needed help, if they needed proof that standing against injustice was possible, they knew where to find me. At the gym. In the sanctuary of iron. Where strength is measured not in weight but in will. My name is Anatoly Petrov. I'm not a hero. I'm not special. I'm just a man who, when faced with the choice to break or stand, chose to stand. And that choice made all the difference. The documentary changed things in ways I never anticipated. Within months of its release, my phone, a simple device I'd kept mostly silent for years, began ringing constantly. Messages flooded in from across Russia, then from other countries. People facing corruption, abuse of power, impossible situations where they felt trapped and alone. At first, I tried to help everyone personally. I'd spend hours on calls, reviewing evidence, offering advice, connecting people with lawyers or journalists or others who could help. But it quickly became overwhelming. There were too many. Too much injustice. Too much pain. That's when Marina found me. She walked into the gym on a Tuesday afternoon, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes and the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she knew exactly what she wanted. She wore a business suit that looked expensive but not ostentatious, and she carried a leather briefcase that had seen years of use. Anatoly Petrov, she said, extending her hand. My name is Marina Voloshyna. I'm an investigative journalist, and I have a proposition for you. I shook her hand, noting the firm grip, the calluses that suggested she spent time doing more than typing. I don't do interviews anymore. This isn't about an interview. It's about amplifying what you've started. You've shown that one person can stand against corruption and win. But imagine what we could do together. You with your experience and courage, me with my platform and investigative resources. We could help hundreds of people instead of dozens. I studied her face, looking for the angles, the hidden agendas. Years in military intelligence had taught me that everyone wants something, and the question is always whether their wants align with yours or conflict with them. What exactly are you proposing? She set her briefcase on a bench, opened it, and pulled out a thick folder. I've been tracking patterns of corruption across Russia for 5 years. Police chiefs extorting business owners. Federal agents manufacturing evidence. Local politicians embezzling funds meant for schools and hospitals. It's everywhere. Anatoly. And people are terrified to speak up because they've seen what happens to those who do. But your story showed them something different, that resistance is possible, that the powerful can fall, that justice isn't just a fairy tale. She spread documents across the bench. Names, dates, locations, patterns of abuse stretching across regions and years. It was overwhelming in its scope, depressing in its thoroughness. "I can expose these people," she continued. "I have the platform, the reach, the credibility. But exposure isn't enough. These victims need more than just their stories told. They need guidance on how to fight back safely, how to gather evidence, how to protect themselves. They need what you can provide." I picked up one of the documents. It detailed a police captain in Novosibirsk who'd been extorting protection money from immigrant business owners for 3 years. The amounts were small enough to avoid attention but large enough to devastate families already struggling. Classic predator behavior. Targeting the vulnerable, those least likely to fight back. "Why me?" I asked. "You could hire security consultants, lawyers, investigators." "Because they haven't lived it. They haven't stood in the rain with guns pointed at them and chosen courage over survival. Victims don't need technical expertise alone. They need proof that resistance is possible. You are that proof. Have you ever been offered a chance to turn your pain into purpose, your trauma into transformation?" What I decided in the next moment would determine not just my future, but the futures of hundreds of people I'd never met. I looked at the documents spread before me, each one representing lives being destroyed by people who believed their power made them untouchable. I thought about the young man, Alexei, who'd come to me for help. About the woman whose brother had been freed because I'd stood against Krupin. About all the messages still flooding my phone from people desperate for guidance. One person couldn't fix all of this. But maybe 2 people could make a bigger difference. And maybe 2 could become 10, and 10 could become 100, until resistance against corruption wasn't an act of desperate courage but a movement of organized strength. "Okay," I said finally. "But we do this carefully. No recklessness. No putting victims in danger for the sake of a good story. Every case we take, we prioritize their safety above everything else." Marina smiled. And it was genuine. I wouldn't have it any other way. That conversation in the gym marked the beginning of what would become known as the Resistance Project, though we never liked that name. It sounded too dramatic, too self-important. We were just people helping people. But the media needed a label, and eventually we stopped fighting it. Marina rented a small office space in a nondescript building near the city center. Nothing fancy, just 3 rooms with basic furniture, computers, and filing cabinets that quickly filled with case files. We brought in 2 others, Dmitry, a former prosecutor who'd been forced out for refusing to prosecute fabricated cases, and Katya, a cybersecurity expert who could track digital trails and protect our communications. Our first case came within a week. A woman named Svetlana contacted us about a factory manager who was sexually harassing female employees and threatening their jobs if they reported him. She'd tried going to HR, to local police, even to regional authorities. Each time, she was told there wasn't enough evidence, or that she was overreacting, or that making waves would only hurt her career. Classic institutional protection of predators. They rely on victims being too afraid, too isolated, too convinced that the system won't help them. Marina and I met with Svetlana in our office. She was nervous, fidgeting with her hands, eyes darting toward the door as if expecting the manager to burst in at any moment. Fear had become her constant companion. "Tell us everything," I said gently. "And know that nothing you say leaves this room without your permission." She spoke for 2 hours. The harassment had started small. Inappropriate comments, lingering touches, suggestive emails. When she tried to maintain professional distance, it escalated. Explicit propositions. Threats veiled as jokes. And finally, an ultimatum. Submit to his advances or lose her job. She documented everything. Emails saved in a private account. Text messages screenshot and backed up. Even audio recordings from her phone when he'd cornered her in his office. She'd been preparing to fight back but had no idea how. "You did exactly right," Marina told her. "This documentation is solid. But we need to be strategic about how we use it." We spent the next 3 weeks building an airtight case. Katya traced the manager's digital communications and found evidence of similar harassment toward other women. Some who'd quit rather than endure it, some who'd been fired when they resisted. Dmitry identified specific labor laws and criminal statutes that had been violated. Marina prepared a comprehensive investigative report. And I worked with Svetlana on the hardest part, finding the courage to move forward when every instinct screamed to hide, to protect herself by staying silent. "I'm terrified," she admitted during one of our sessions. What if this destroys my career? What if no one believes me? What if he retaliates? Those are all valid fears, I said. And I won't lie to you, fighting back is hard. There will be consequences. But staying silent also has consequences. Living in fear, letting him continue hurting you and others, surrendering your power to someone who abuses his, those consequences last forever. She was quiet for a long moment. When Kruppen had you trapped, when he threatened to destroy your life, what made you decide to fight instead of comply? I thought back to that night in the rain, to the moment I'd had to choose. I realized I'd rather risk everything fighting for what was right than guarantee my safety by surrendering my dignity. And I understood that if I broke, if I became his puppet, I'd lose myself completely. At least if I fought and lost, I'd lose as myself. She nodded slowly, processing this. I don't want to lose myself. Then you already know what you have to do. We released the report on a Thursday morning. Marina published it through her network, complete with documentation, witness testimony, and the manager's own words captured in emails and recordings. By noon, it had been picked up by national media. By evening, the factory owner had suspended the manager pending investigation. By the next morning, 3 more women had come forward with their own stories. The manager tried to fight back. He hired expensive lawyers, threatened defamation suits, called in favors with local authorities. But the evidence was too strong, the public attention too intense, the pattern of behavior too clear to deny. 6 weeks later, he was fired and criminally charged. Svetlana kept her job, received a settlement, and became an advocate for other women facing workplace harassment. Thank you, she told us the day the charges were filed. You gave me back my power. But I knew the truth. We hadn't given her anything. We'd just shown her that the power had been hers all along. The cases multiplied. A teacher being bullied into resigning by a corrupt principal. A whistleblower facing retaliation for exposing safety violations. A small business owner being extorted by local officials. Each case was different, but the pattern was always the same. Someone with power abusing it, someone vulnerable feeling trapped, and a system that protected the powerful while abandoning the weak. We couldn't take every case. There were too many, and our resources were limited. We had to prioritize based on severity, documentation, and likelihood of success. Each rejection letter I wrote felt like a small betrayal, but we simply couldn't help everyone. What we could do was teach people to help themselves. Marina started a series of articles on resistance fundamentals. How to document abuse, how to protect evidence, how to find allies, how to approach media or legal authorities safely. I conducted workshops at the gym and community centers, sharing practical skills for confronting corruption. The authorities started paying attention. Not always in ways we liked. 8 months into the resistance project, I was approached by 2 men in suits outside my apartment. They didn't identify themselves as police or federal agents, but everything about them screamed official authority. Mr. Petrov, the taller one said, we'd like to have a conversation with you. My body tensed automatically, memories of Kruppen flooding back. But I forced myself to stay calm, to assess rationally. About what? About your activities. You've been involving yourself in several sensitive situations, making accusations against respected officials, encouraging people to take actions that could be considered problematic. I've been helping people exercise their legal rights. Last time I checked, that wasn't a crime. The shorter one smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course not. We're just concerned that you might be getting in over your head. These situations can be complex, dangerous, even. It would be unfortunate if something happened to you or your associates. There it was. Not quite a threat, but close enough. The implication clear: back off, or face consequences. Have you ever had to decide whether to retreat to safety or push forward knowing the danger has just increased? In moments, you'll see why sometimes the only way to win is to call their bluff. I looked at both men carefully, memorizing their faces. Are you threatening me? Not at all, the tall one said smoothly. We're offering friendly advice. From people who know how these things work. Then let me offer you some advice in return, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. I document everything. Every conversation, every threat, every attempt at intimidation. And I have friends in media who would love to know that unnamed officials are trying to silence someone helping victims of corruption. So if something unfortunate does happen to me or my associates, the first place investigators will look is at people who issued friendly advice days before. The shorter one's smile disappeared. They exchanged a glance. Then the tall one handed me a business card. Blank except for a phone number. In case you change your mind and want to discuss things more cooperatively. They walked away, leaving me standing on the sidewalk with a business card I'd never call and a clear message. We were making powerful people nervous. I immediately called Marina, Dmitry, and Katya. We met at the office within the hour. They're trying to intimidate us, Marina said after I described the encounter. Classic corruption playbook. First they ignore you, then they mock you, then they threaten you, then they fight you. The question is what we do about it, Dmitry added. Do we back off, play it safe, or do we push harder? I thought about Svetlana, about Alexei, about the woman whose brother had been freed, about the hundreds of messages from people desperate for help. I thought about the moment I'd stood in the rain with Krupin's guns pointed at me and had to choose. We push harder, I said. But smarter. We document everything. We protect ourselves better. We build more public support so it's harder for them to move against us quietly. And we find cases that expose the people trying to shut us down. Katya had been quiet, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard. I might have something, she said, turning the screen so we could see. Remember those unnamed officials who just threatened Anatoly? I've been running facial recognition on security footage from near his apartment. One of them matches a deputy minister in the Interior Ministry named Sergei Volkov. And guess what? He's been named in 3 corruption investigations over the past 2 years, but each time the cases mysteriously disappeared. Marina leaned forward, her journalist instincts fully activated. If we could prove he's actively trying to shut down our operation to protect his own corruption. It would be a massive story, Dmitry finished. And it would show that we're not backing down. It was risky. Taking on a deputy minister was several levels above even what I'd done with Krupin. But sometimes the only way to protect yourself from predators is to make yourself too dangerous to attack. We spent the next month building a case against Volkov. Katya traced financial irregularities in projects he'd overseen. Marina interviewed sources who'd witnessed his corruption firsthand but had been too afraid to speak publicly. Dmitry identified legal violations and connections to organized crime. And I worked on finding the victims. People Volkov had hurt who might be willing to come forward if they knew they weren't alone. We found 7 of them. A contractor who'd been forced to pay bribes for permits. A journalist who'd been threatened for investigating Volkov's finances. A civil servant who'd been fired for refusing to falsify reports. Each had their own story of how Volkov had used his position for personal gain and punished anyone who challenged him. The day before we planned to release our report, I received a phone call from an unknown number. Anatoly Petrov. The voice was cultured, confident, and completely unfamiliar. My name is General Viktor Orlov. I'm calling regarding your investigation into Deputy Minister Volkov. Every alarm in my head started ringing. A general calling personally? This was either very good or very bad. I'm listening, I said carefully. I've been monitoring your work with interest. The Resistance Project, your efforts to expose corruption, your refusal to be intimidated. It's admirable. And I want you to know that not everyone in authority is like Krupin or Volkov. Some of us actually believe in justice. Why are you calling? Because tomorrow, when you release your report on Volkov, you're going to paint a target on your back that no amount of media attention will protect you from. Volkov has powerful allies. They will move against you, and they won't be subtle about it. So you're calling to warn me off? No. There was steel in his voice now. I'm calling to tell you that you're not alone. There are people within the system who want to see men like Volkov exposed. We can't move openly, we'd be destroyed, but we can provide support from the shadows. Protection. Information. Allies in the right places when you need them. Why would you do that? A long pause. Because I'm tired of watching corruption rot my country from the inside. Because I've spent 30 years in service, and I've seen good men destroyed while bad men prospered. And because someone needs to fight back, and I'm not positioned to do it. But you are. Could be a trap. Could be another intimidation tactic. Or it could be genuine, a powerful ally offering help when we needed it most. What do you need from me? I asked. Nothing. Just do what you're already doing. Expose the truth. Help the victims. Stand against corruption. And know that when things get difficult, and they will, there are people working behind the scenes to ensure you survive long enough to keep fighting. The line went dead. I sat in my apartment for a long time after that call, weighing the possibilities. In the end, I decided it didn't matter whether General Orlov was legitimate or not. We'd already committed to releasing the report on Volkov. We'd already chosen to push forward rather than retreat. And whether we had secret allies or not, the work remained the same. We released the report the next day. It was comprehensive, damning, and backed by irrefutable evidence. Within hours, it had spread across Russian media and social platforms. By evening, it had been picked up internationally. Volkov's response was swift and vicious. He denied everything, called us liars and conspirators, threatened legal action. His allies in media published hit pieces questioning our motives and credibility. Anonymous accounts on social media spread rumors about me, that I was mentally unstable, that I was working for foreign intelligence, that the whole resistance project was a front for criminal activity. But something interesting happened. For every attack against us, 2 defenders appeared. Journalists we'd never met started investigating Volkov independently and confirming our findings. Civil rights organizations issued statements of support. And ordinary citizens, thousands of them, shared the report and added their own stories of corruption they'd witnessed or experienced. The tide of public opinion was turning, and Volkov could feel it. 3 days after we released the report, Volkov resigned from his position to spend more time with family. It was the standard euphemism for being forced out. 2 weeks later, criminal charges were filed against him. And within a month, 3 of his associates had also resigned or been removed from their positions. We'd won. Not completely. Volkov's trial would take years, and he might still escape justice through expensive lawyers and remaining connections. But we'd exposed him. We'd shown that even deputy ministers weren't untouchable. We'd proven that resistance worked. The night after Volkov's resignation was announced, my phone rang again. The same unknown number. "Congratulations," General Orlov said. "You've done what many thought impossible. We couldn't have done it alone." No, you couldn't. But you did the most important part. You refused to be intimidated. You stood when standing was dangerous. Everything else built on that foundation. What happens now? Now more people come to you for help. Now more corrupt officials feel fear for the first time in years. Now the work gets harder, because you've proven you're a genuine threat to the system they've built. Sounds like you're trying to scare me. He laughed, a sound without humor. I'm trying to prepare you. This is only the beginning, Anatoly. You've won a battle. But the war against corruption? That never ends. The question is whether you have the strength to keep fighting. I thought about the gym, about the iron I lifted every day, about the discipline and will required to push beyond limits. I've been preparing for this my entire life without knowing it. Good. Because Russia needs you. Not as a hero. Heroes get martyred. But as a constant irritant, a persistent reminder that corruption has consequences. A proof that ordinary people can fight back and win. Can you be that? I can try. That's all anyone can ask. The line went dead again, and I never heard from General Orlov after that. I don't know if he was real or a fiction created by someone with different motives. But his word stayed with me, not a hero, but a persistent reminder. Not a single great victory, but a constant presence pushing back against injustice. The resistance project continued to grow. Within a year, we had offices in 3 cities. Within 2 years, we'd helped expose corruption cases in 7 regions. Other organizations formed, inspired by our example, each focusing on different areas of injustice: environmental protection, labor rights, political transparency. It wasn't a revolution. It was something more sustainable, a gradual shift in culture, a slow erosion of the belief that power was absolute and resistance was futile. But the work took its toll. Marina burned out after 3 years and left to write a book about our experiences. Dmitry was offered a position in a reform-minded prosecutor's office and took it, believing he could do more good from inside the system. Katia met someone, got married, and decided she wanted a quieter life. New people came to replace them, bringing fresh energy and perspectives. But the constant exposure to suffering, to corruption, to the worst of what people do when they have power, it wore on all of us. You can't spend years staring into darkness without some of it staining your soul. I found myself training harder at the gym, pushing my body to extremes, using physical pain to distract from emotional exhaustion. The iron had always been my sanctuary, but now it became something more desperate, a way to prove I was still strong, still unbroken, still capable of fighting. One morning, 5 years after my confrontation with Krupin, I woke up and realized I was tired. Not physically tired. I'd been training so hard I was probably in the best shape of my life. But emotionally, spiritually tired. Tired of hearing stories of suffering. Tired of fighting battles that seemed to multiply faster than we could win them. Tired of being the person everyone looked to for strength when I felt empty inside. I went to the gym anyway, because that's what discipline means, showing up especially when you don't want to. But as I loaded the barbell, as I prepared for my usual training session, I found myself just standing there, staring at the weights, feeling nothing. That's when Ivan approached. My old training partner, the one who told me years ago to go with strength when I faced Krupin. "Brother," he said quietly, "you're carrying too much weight. And I'm not talking about the barbell." I wanted to deny it, to claim I was fine, to maintain the facade of strength. But Ivan had known me too long, had trained beside me through too many sessions, had seen me on my worst days and best days. "I don't know how to stop," I admitted. "People need help. Corruption continues. If I stop fighting, if I rest, what happens to them? What happens to you if you don't rest? Have you ever reached the point where your strength becomes your weakness, where your determination to help others starts destroying yourself? In the next moments, you'll learn why sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you're breaking. Ivan gestured to a bench, and we sat. "Let me tell you something I learned the hard way," he said. "Strength isn't infinite. You can't pour from an empty cup. And right now, brother, you're running on fumes and willpower, which might be enough for today, maybe tomorrow, but eventually you'll collapse. And then you'll help no one. So what do I do? Just abandon everyone who needs help? No. You build a system that doesn't depend entirely on you. You train others to do what you do. You create structures that continue even when you step back. And you take care of yourself, because a burned-out activist is no better than no activist at all." He was right. I'd been operating under the assumption that I had to personally fight every battle, help every victim, expose every corrupt official. But that was arrogance disguised as heroism. The work was bigger than me, and it needed to be sustainable beyond my personal capacity. I took a month off. It felt wrong, irresponsible, like abandoning my post. But I did it anyway. I stopped answering the phones at the Resistance Project. I handed cases to other team members. I stepped back from investigations and interviews. And I focused on the basics: training, eating, sleeping, existing without the constant weight of other people's pain. During that month, I reconnected with parts of myself I'd forgotten. I read books that had nothing to do with corruption or injustice, poetry, philosophy, even fiction. I took long walks through Moscow without purpose or destination. I sat in cafes and watched people live their ordinary lives, reminded that most of human existence wasn't defined by dramatic battles between good and evil but by small moments of connection, joy, and meaning. And slowly, carefully, I began to heal. When I returned to the Resistance Project after that month, I came back different. Not weaker, despite my fears. Stronger, actually, because I'd learned the difference between sustainable commitment and self-destructive martyrdom. I implemented changes. We hired more staff so no single person carried too much load. We created rotation systems so people could step away and recover. We brought in therapists to help our team process the vicarious trauma of hearing so many painful stories. And we focused on building networks and systems rather than depending on individual heroes. The work continued, but healthier, more sustainable.